and good evening to all. We have come back again with another wonderful session today, which is being organized by Bar Council of Delhi, along with the International Bridges to Justice India and COVID Response Alliance of India on Child Protection. And I now request Mr. Anant Asthana from the COVID Response Alliance of India on Child Protection to give a brief introduction about Professor Liefaard.
Thank you, Ajay. Welcome, Professor Liefaard. It's indeed a privilege to have you with us, and we all are very excited to hear you on the topic. I have been asked to read out a brief introduction of Professor Liefaard, so I'm going to do that. Professor Liefaard is Vice Dean of Leiden Law School in the Netherlands, and he holds UNICEF Chair in Children's Rights at the same university, Leiden University. He is also director of the master's program, which is LL.M, Advanced Studies in International Children's Rights. And he also coordinates the Leiden Summer School on International Children's Rights. In 2015, he received the award for the best lecturer of Leiden Law School. Professor Liefaard is a substitute justice at the Court of Appeal in The Hague and a member of the Council for the Administration of Criminal Justice and Protection of Juveniles. He regularly works as a consultant for international organizations, UN agencies, Council of Europe, and European Union. And Professor Liefaard holds a master and a PhD in law from VU University, Amsterdam. Professor Liefaard, this event is being organized jointly by Bar Council of Delhi, which is the licensing authority for lawyers practicing in Delhi, and International Bridges for Justice, and of course the Alliance, the COVID Response Alliance. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. Over to you, Ajay.
Thank you, Anand.
Thank you so much, Mr. Verma, Mr. Asthana, dear colleagues, dear students. I see some former students in the room. It is a wonderful opportunity. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's also an honor to be part of your impressive series, a series that is so important, I think, in these times, disturbing times, distressing times, for everyone working in the field of child rights, child protection, juvenile justice, and the many other fields that are relevant for children and families. But of course, above all, these are distressing times for children and families who find themselves in very difficult circumstances that have, first of all, been dominated by the pandemic and the measures taken as a result of that, or in response to that, basically. But also, it is also distressing because it is likely that the impact of this all will continue for at least the next months, maybe years. And of course, we all have to be extremely concerned, I think, and focused on the long-term impact of this all on basically a whole generation. So when I was invited to join you in this series, first of all, I felt honored, but also I felt that it was an opportunity to contribute to a dialogue that is, of course, very relevant for India. But I think with all your commitment and also the presence of others in the room today, I think it is also an opportunity to contribute to an international dialogue on this, because I think that is very much needed, because we see that the impact of the pandemic, as well as the measures taken in response to it, it was really a global issue. There is impact everywhere. High income, middle income, low income countries, of course, the impact is different, but there is impact, and it's major. And I think we have to join forces in providing solutions to the most vulnerable and I think that includes also children. So thank you for the opportunity, really. What I would like to do is because I know that you've been involved in discussions already, and you're actually working on different topics that are relevant here. I would like to zoom out a bit and to provide an international perspective on your work, on your concerns. And you are the real experts in India and beyond in specific fields. So please consider my talk also as an invitation to share your experience and to challenge me, but also the others in the room to think along, to assist, to see what we can do together to make the, to offer opportunities to children and families that enable them to get out of this in a good way. So I'm going to zoom out by providing an international perspective, and I would like to provide you with a children's rights perspective. So I would like to split up my 30 minutes into two parts. And one is actually, what do we see happening across the globe? And what does that mean for children's rights? That is, I think, to a certain extent overlapping what you've already discussed. But I think it is good to give you as a starter that general global perspective. Then, in addition to that, that's the second part of my talk. I would like to address the question: why is it at this point so critical, so vital, to talk about children's rights as a human rights reality and frame for children, and also for measures taken in response to pandemic such as COVID-19. So why is it important to talk children's rights rather than focusing on well-being only, or future, children as the future generation? No, why is it important to talk a human rights language here? So I would like to talk to you about that, and then we'll probably end up in a discussion around what can we do then in that particular with that particular framework as our guiding tool, basically. So that's basically my plan. So taking you to the international level, what do we see? In a recent updated technical note from the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action, which is a coalition of different global international civil society and intergovernmental organizations, I think the first point made is that the COVID-19 pandemic affects children in 3 different ways. And the first one is that COVID-19 may have infected children. And that is the first impact, of course. And we know that that children have, that's at least what the WHO reports, that children have the same risk compared to adults to get infected. At the same time, we see that the impact of that on children is likely to be less severe. So it's like less likely that children really suffer from it. Of course, exceptions confirm the rule, but that is the general approach also carried out by the WHO. The second effect of the pandemic is the social and economic impact of the measures taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you should think of, the control, containment, and mitigation intended to, and I quote, to reduce or stop the transmission of the virus. So, closing schools, lockdowns, etc. And then the third one is the potential long-term impact of this all on the economy, and also on the realization, I think, of everything that is related to the development of a certain community, country, and the global community. So there's 3 levels of impact. Short-term, the pandemic itself, the impact related to the measures, and the long-term impact that we have, in my view, be particularly concerned about now that we are getting out of the first stages and transitioning back into some kind of normal mode, whatever that means. Well, what we have seen so far is that we have reason to be very concerned about access to basic services, so for children. And that is directly related to very fundamental children's rights. So we are thinking, we have to talk about food, we have to talk about nutrition, we have to talk about access to water and sanitation, we have to talk about access to healthcare, we have to talk about, and then also in particular also the regular healthcare, which may be under threat of being accessible because of all the attention that was devoted to the pandemic. Think also in this regard about the large-scale immunization projects that have been put on hold for a while that may have long-lasting impact. There are serious issues with regard to access to cash and to cash grants in order to secure adequate standard of living, which, as you probably all know, is directly related to one of the rights of children, that you have the right to an adequate standard of living, Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But access to basic services is, I think, also a matter of access to quality education. And there you see that there, because of the measures taken, children were, forced out of school. For that matter, they may have been, may have had less access to food, for example, because food is distributed through the schools. But in terms of the quality of the education, there are many reasons to be concerned about access of children through the online systems into the educational system. And also, there are also concerns about contact between the teachers and the children, which is a very important element of a quality educational system, also because of the social interaction. There are very big concerns about poverty. So there is a big rise of numbers of children that are affected by extreme poverty. If I'm not mistaken, I think a recent report of UNICEF and WHO reports that there is reason to believe that the number of children that live in household poverty will rise by the end of the year with 86 million, which is an increase of 15%. Well, we all know that poverty is one of the biggest barriers for full implementation of children's rights. So we have so much reason to be extremely worried about it. This, of course, could be divided into a discussion around extreme poverty versus, poverty in let's say, high-income countries. But also in high-income countries, you see that poverty is an issue, resulting in exclusion from community activities, resulting in an increase of the number of families that have reason to be concerned about family income, for example, as a result of parents losing jobs. So a very recent study we did in the Netherlands, for example, in my own country, also confirms this, is that there is an increase of the level of poverty, which is, of course, not extreme poverty, but it is ultimately affecting children's opportunities to engage in community life, and that is seriously worrying. Families and communities are directly affected. And of course, in the children's rights framework, family plays a vital role. Children's rights are about the rights of individual children, but it's very interesting, of course, to bear in mind that there is no other human rights framework that so firmly confirms the relevance of the position of the family. So the position of the family for the realization of children's rights is critical. So the disruption that has taken place within families and communities as a result of the COVID-19 measures and the long-term impact the measures will have on families, and for example, as part of that, family structures, family connections, family engagement, family income, of course, as I mentioned already, is a serious concern directly in relation to children's rights. There is reason to assume, and it's confirmed also by initial research, is that the vulnerable children, so within the group of children, the vulnerable children, are likely to be hit harder and harder. And then we are talking about girls, we are talking about disadvantaged children, divides, also digital divides may be exacerbated. Refugee migrant children, children with mental health needs, children in alternative care, children with disabilities, children in the justice system. There is all reason to be very concerned about their particular position, also in light of the fact that they are already belonging to the most disadvantaged groups in society and the most vulnerable groups in society. In relation to this, many of these children, in general, are less visible than other children communities. And that enhances their vulnerability. So we have to make sure that we increase the visibility of these groups of children by addressing their issues in particular, by demanding attention for specific groups, like, for example, the huge attention at the moment for children in alternative care and the children in institutions. But it has to deliver, of course, ultimately also more visibility and more accountability for these particular children. And then I think there is a general reason to be extremely worried about violence. Violence in the home, violence in the labor setting, violence in institutions, violence online. It is striking to see that through from the very beginning of the pandemic, there have been reports on the increased risks children run on the internet, and with them going more online, there is a bigger chance that they may be subjected to forms of exploitation, and that is really, really worrying. But also, violence in the home as a result of the whole family in the home. Pressure on the family, etc. I think there is reason to be very concerned about. So why is it then important to talk about children's rights? My second part. I will list a number of reasons why we should talk about rights here. If you go through all the materials developed by key stakeholders internationally, there is a lot of attention for children. There is a lot of attention for children's well-being. There is reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. There is reference to rights. But I'm still concerned that we move around the very core of the added value of the rights paradigm or the rights narrative. Why is it important to talk about rights? Why is it important to talk about the threats that all these realities are to the rights of children? That is because of a number of reasons. The first one is that the rights framework is clearly normative with universal potential. And given that this is a pandemic that has global reach and is affecting all parts of the world, it is offering us an opportunity to talk the same language wherever we are and wherever we are working with or for children, or wherever we are concerned about children. And this normative framework is built on fundamental notions that turn out to be extremely relevant. Human dignity, non-discrimination and equality. And these fundamental pillars of the normative framework offer a lot of opportunities also to continuously raise attention around the importance of specific focus on children. The rights of children are not without commitment. They are directly attached to the government taking responsibility for children. They require action. They demand action. and they revolve around the accountability of government. And this is, I think, in reality, very strong. In the very beginning of the pandemic, the primary focus was on the protection of public health. And there's all the reason to be extremely concerned about that. But the rights narrative provides us with a check and a balance. And they say, listen, we understand that you need to talk about public health security, that you need to step in and to take responsibility for everyone. And as part of that, also for the most vulnerable, let's say the elderly. But at a certain time, at a certain point, you can't stay away from the tough question, what are you doing for the children? Why? Because you have committed yourself to this human rights framework. And you are not on your own. This is done by all countries but one. Let's forget that one, just the US. But all the others have committed. So that is what you share here in terms of your responsibility. So it's not without commitment. On the contrary, it's with a lot of commitment. And it means that you have to explain also as the government what you're doing to reduce the impact, and more positively, what you're doing to tackle negative impact. So in terms of positive obligations. Children's rights, therefore, cannot be set aside easily. Yes, human rights provisions can be derogated from in times of emergency, in times of crisis. So that offers you as a government a temporary solution if you can't do everything at the same time. Reasonable. But it has to be necessary. It has to be proportionate. And it also means that it is after a certain time, you should reflect on that. And you should maybe adjust. And you should focus again on your rights obligations. And this is also what the Committee on the Rights of the Child, based in Geneva, does in its conversations with the government. You know, calling upon them to explain why it is still necessary to, for example, derogate from human rights obligations. And I know that this week, this was also brought to a challenge in South Africa, for example, where there was the constitutional question brought forward to a court, whether it was still reasonable, necessary, proportionate to uphold the lockdown, among others, because it has such a devastating impact on children. And the court ruled that it was indeed unconstitutional, but it's now taken up to the higher court and then to the constitutional court, so we don't know where we stand. But it is interesting that it is actually used also, the children's rights framework in that regard. Then, not secondly, I mean, I'm listing already, I hope you can follow me, but children's rights are also indivisible. And they are also interdependent. So it means that even though we have particular concerns about children and violence, or children with disabilities, or children in institutional care, ultimately, this is about rights altogether. And that gives us, I think, a very strong, comprehensive narrative. Also to call upon the government, say, listen, we have to do it better because we cannot over-focus on health. We also have to invest in family. We also have to bring the focus back to support, to in terms of education, in terms of leisure and playtime, in terms of opportunities for children to benefit from their rights comprehensively. And it also prevents us from being picky and being focused on only one right rather than taking them comprehensively. And that altogether gives us a very strong narrative to not shy away from the very fundamental issues that are at stake here. And that is, as I mentioned, dignity issues, equality issues, inclusivity issues. And I know, for example, that within the disabilities movement, these very big fundamental frames are used all the time to call upon everyone to change the normal, and not to go back to. So in that sense, I think the COVID-19 opportunity situation also offers us opportunities to maybe change the narrative and say, listen, we are not going back to normal. We are going to build back better. We have to learn from it. We have to keep the focus on the right vulnerabilities in our system. But maybe that's too ambitious, because we have also to be very, very concerned on actual children as we speak. Then one final point that I want to make, why it's so important to talk about children's rights, is that children's rights offers us a framework that is multi-layered, in the sense that it is getting attention at the international level, at regional levels in different ways, at the government national level, but also lower. And the children's rights framework also includes the judiciary, the role of ombudspersons or national human rights commissions. So you can all use these commissions, who are grounded in the protection of human rights, and more particularly children's rights, to make the case for you, to put the pressure on those who are primarily accountable. We should not forget the private sector, by the way. But of course, we are also talking to the public sector, and we should keep the pressure on by using that framework. And if you start to talk about child well-being only, or SDGs only, then you don't benefit from the existence of this rather strong infrastructure. And that is, I think, a very important asset of the whole children's rights framework. So, what does it mean? What should we do together? I think also because of this comprehensiveness of children's rights, we have to look for an integration of the different challenges with regard to children in order to secure an integral approach that is well coordinated and that is also moving beyond the silos in which many of the children's rights matters are often dealt with. This is big, I realize that. But last week I was on the Dutch radio and I said, listen, there has to be a task force in the government or an envoy or a special person, I don't know who, but someone who takes the lead in making sure that all the relevant departments are working together, so that they know from each other what they are doing. First of all, when they issue measures in response to the pandemic, but second, also in offering solutions. So the Justice Department needs to know what the Health Department is doing, and social affairs should be involved as well as economics, foreign affairs, etc. So you need to coordinate. And that's a horizontal coordination. But if you look at the different levels of government, so let's say this national government, state government, and provincial and local, there has to be coordination there as well. And of course, as part of that communication. So who's taking the lead? Who is actually the person to bring people to the table? Who is actually the person who collects the different data that are available or should be available? Who is the person who make people work together so that we can collectively make a difference? There is two final points I would like to make. And one is that I'm a strong proponent of securing access to justice in these times. What do I mean? I mentioned to you the case that was undertaken in South Africa. What I take from that case is that at a certain point, you should not shy away from addressing the government in its very core of the obligations. That is not an easy way, as you all know, also many lawyers in the room, but it is an avenue that children's rights provide you. And it's an avenue that we should use because it forces us, with the support of the judiciary, and of course they make their independent assessment, which is very important, gives credibility. But if it works, then it puts the pressure on the government. And we have seen in normal circumstances, non-pandemic related circumstances, that we can make a difference there. Also in this country, litigation has had impact. I remember that Mr. Astana contributed to a chapter in a book that we did on litigating the rights of the child. But you see it happening everywhere, on economic, social, cultural rights, on fundamental civil rights, and it's important. And children's rights provide children and families with a way into the justice system by claiming their rights through the judicial system. So that is one way I think we should not shy away from, even though it's not the only way. And then the final point I would like to make, and then I would like to open up, is that we should include children. It's extremely important to make use or to build on one of the pillars of the Children's Rights Convention, and that is that children have the right to be heard, and that children, in relation to that, have participatory rights. Their involvement in your strategies, in your research, in your policy, in your advocacy, is enriching. It's preventing that we are disconnecting or disconnected to what they actually need and want. And it provides an opportunity, I think, to reflect on what we are doing and what is really needed to enable children to get back into some kind of normal that enables them to develop and to become full-blown citizens of society. And that is, I think, in the interest not only of children, but it's also in the interest of society as a whole. So with that, I think I should close for now. I've given you a rather broad picture, but I'm open to all the questions.
Thank you, Professor Liefaard. In fact, the importance of task force and other aspects you have really emphasized. And today's situation, definitely those are the actions which we all need to do collectively. And that's the reason this coalition, this COVID alliance is really working well on certain lines. And I think I'm sure there will be a lot more partners to this COVID response alliance of India on child protection. And they will be also supported by legal lawyers, legal professionals. Now, there are certain questions, and I think by breaching a regular protocol, what I would like to do is this, that I would request that person to enable and ask the question directly and kindly be brief, and we would like to accommodate as many as people we can. So I request Miss Rosie, please, you can enable your video and ask your question.
What I wanted to say is, like you said, there are multi-level framework for child rights. But the thing in India is, people filing PIL or we at the government level working hours, we work very hard and all the things are present. But what we see is, like you said, the impact is very less. What do you think the most important thing right now that India should do so that the child rights, go to another level, the more successful one?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very valid point. I mean, progress is slow. And the problem with the pandemic and also the impact of the pandemic is that we don't have much time. So you need to be, you need to operate in a very concrete way, I think, at the moment. And and litigation takes a long time, etc. But I think my point here is that we should not, nevertheless, we should not shy away from raising the fundamentals here, because this will have long-lasting impact, this whole Corona crisis, and that means that we have to start by making a strategy for the next months and the next years. But meanwhile, we have to put our focus on the most specific needs. So think, for example, on about if we focus on child protection, you have to make sure that you start to work there, for example, by supporting professionals, to do work, to go into the families, to go into the communities, to see within the limitations a lockdown offers you, that you can make children more visible, for example. I think the visibility issue of children is extremely critical at the moment. So we should not wait for policies to be developed or for legislation to be adjusted. We can't. So if you take a look at the biggest vulnerabilities, I think we have to make children more visible by bringing them out, by reaching out to them in their communities with whatever means we can think of. So, for example, internationally, there is a strong focus on the care worker, for example, but also on the child helplines, to see to what extent you can actually reach out to individual children and groups of children so that you can make them visible. Because without visibility, it's very likely that we will not make any progress. That's why I was quite surprised by the enormous international focus on children deprived of liberty. That particular group doesn't get attention at all normally. But in one of the first calls from the executive director of UNICEF was on children deprived of liberty. I was blown away by it. Where does that come from? But the point is valid because these children are inside an institution. If there's corona inside, then of course you have urgent matters. So, and I know that in some African countries, they have said they've opened up the doors of the institution. So they've released children. And of course that causes all kinds of problems, but they've done it. So there is a strong need, I think, for visibility. So making the most vulnerable children visible. And by making them visible, by reaching out to them, by enabling them to contact helplines, by offering them digital opportunities, by inviting them to make their voices heard, because that is, of course, a big challenge with the most vulnerable groups, I think we will be able to do something which is needed. But at the same time, I think we have to invest collectively in our long-term strategy, middle and long-term strategy. And that includes, I think, also litigation.
Thank you, Professor. May I request Bharti Aliji to directly ask the question you had?
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you so much, Ton, for that talk. I do have a couple of questions, and on some issues I probably will also seek your views. My first question to you is if you could share with us some of the measures that have been taken in the Netherlands on, as you suggested, and very rightly said so, that we need to visibilize the invisible children. So any specific measures that you could share with us. The other is about accountability. So you just mentioned about children in institutional care. And often enough, you get very little information about these children. And in situations of pandemic, I don't know how to ensure that accountability and how to get that data. Is there a certain non-negotiable set of data that you are seeking and demanding for? And is that readily available? So some questions around that. And my third question to you is whether the child protection services in Netherlands are declared as essential services, because in India we have struggled with this whole question of whether child helpline should be an essential service or not. During the lockdown, only essential services were functioning, and we did have issues in India to get our child helpline function fully and optimally. So that's my third question, and the last one is about the funding situation for the civil society organizations that are focusing on children's issues, on issues of access to justice. How do you look at that? What is your viewpoint, and what should be, as groups that have been engaging on child protection issues, do about ensuring that the funding does not get is not affected? Thank you so much, Ton.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions and nice to see you. And thank for joining. It is, good questions that I think come back to a number of core issues, and one is, I think, priority. But let me start with the Netherlands, maybe. So what we see is that quite soon after the pandemic started to kick in and the government issued different kinds of measures, there were bits of information that came out through media. So reports on children being stuck in home thousands of children that were out of sight all of a sudden while they were in schools before. And when I saw that, I said, listen, I contacted UNICEF at the national level, and I said, listen, who is actually trying to get an overview? Who is trying to make sure that we don't miss children? Because there is attention for violence in the home, there's some attention for refugee children, but it's quite silent on that side. There is some attention for poverty, but I mean, who is actually taking a lead in getting the overview? And then what we did there is we listed what we consider as the 80 plus, so 87 biggest risk children may face as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures taken for it, against it. And we said, okay, we are going to map what we know, who is working on it, who is actually in charge of it in terms of responsibilities, so in terms of the government. Is there any inspection mechanism that we can rely on? And what could then be the next steps to collectively make sure that this group of children doesn't fall off the agenda? So we have tried to do that and it may sound like an academic exercise, but it sure wasn't, because we did it quickly. Within 2 weeks, we gathered everything that we could find, news messages, reports, maybe individual claims, whatever. And then we have now published it and said, listen, this shows that we have to gather data. We have to make sure that we do that. We continue to do that, and we have to make sure that we ultimately force people to collaborate, because there's so many people that can do something on different levels, but there's someone who needs to coordinate that. What is then in practical terms done, for example, by services? I mean, I know that, for example, in relation to violence in the home, that quite quickly after the lockdown was, and we had a bit of an open lockdown, so there was some opportunity to move around. I know that the Child Protection Services, they went out. So they were also given the liberty to go out. And that is related to your essential services question. I think that shows that we found that particular essential at that moment. And I know that the Dutch Children's Ombudsperson, she also made the claim quite quickly, let's say in 10 days, I don't know exactly, but in 10 days after the lockdown started, to say, listen, even though we have now the lockdown, we need to make sure that the children that are completely out of sight and run the risk of being subjected to violence or something, we need to enable them to go back to school in one or the other way. And so there was a children's ombudsperson that also jumped on it. So these kind of things happened, but it was rather fragmented. And that's why we said, no, there has to be someone who takes a lead in getting the overview. And the data are so critical. And even though they are not perfect, at least we know a bit more because we put it together. That is also related to accountability, because if you have these data, you can also say to the government, okay, what are you doing? Show us what you're doing. And even though the world is not perfect and we understand that you have all kinds of problems and issues and budget issues, etc., show us what you're doing. Show us how you prioritize. Why do you invest so much money in getting the economy back on track? And in our country, it meant that everyone was talking about the gym. And I said, listen, what are you doing to talk about people that are in need of your attention? What are you doing there? Forget about the gym. You can go outside in a few months. You can run. I mean, that's fine. Talk about vulnerable children. Now, so I think that is, but data ultimately is an issue. So what I know, and that was your question about the availability of data sets, for example. I know that there is something happening in the sense that there are quite some data collections now on the website of UNICEF, for example, which helped us, for example, to make the list of the 87 risks. They are available. I'm happy to share what we did. I know that there is now an initiative called COVID under 19, and it's a questionnaire that is being sent out to I think countries with 15 different languages to get input from children themselves. And these data will be available also for everyone. So the questionnaires will be available for everyone. So there are some kind of initiatives like this. But we have to share practices there because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Then essential services. Yeah, I think this is really a matter of priority. So you have to make sure that those services that are essential for children and families, that they are on the list, of course. And I think that could be done also through the children's rights claim. So listen, we understand that you have to prioritize. You have to be careful at the same time. But with investing or giving priority to services that are so essential to the most vulnerable, you will probably prevent a lot of harm done and also a lot of resources needed to repair that. So it's a claim you could maybe make that if you invest now, you can also prevent that you run into troubles later. But it's difficult because I would say, why shouldn't you prioritize a helpline? What is the issue there? Why can't that happen? While at the same time, I understand that the government has many requests in that regard and has to be very careful. But the same is true for budget. How much budget can you allocate for children's services? It is ultimately a matter of priority, and there is choice. So the question is, how can you get access to the budgetary considerations? We often focus only on policy, advocacy, litigation, legislation, but the budget cycle is extremely important. So as soon as, but I think you can use children's rights as a way into the budget. Say, listen, best interest of the child is a primary consideration, means that you have to include it in the budget system. So explain to me why you think that this budget is giving enough attention to children, and if not, then what are you going to do to change that? But it may require reallocation of budget. But there is studies, of course, of very poor countries that have invested relatively large sum of money to those services that are particularly important for children. So there are choices to be made. And that is, I think, you have to try to get hold on, these kind of choices, difficult as it is, and you may need all kinds of political force to make that happen, but that is it. And I think then, apart from that, government money is one thing, but if you can make a claim that you are collectively, as a civil society community, set yourself some kind of important and relevant data-based targets, then you may find money elsewhere.
Thank you.
But that also requires, I think, coordination. Yeah.
Thank you. We have Veronica. May I request you to ask your question, Veronica?
Well, thanks for this opportunity to ask a question. Mine is related to somehow vulnerable children, and specifically children without parental care. And I was wondering, it could be at these times of the pandemic or even beyond, like what is the extent of the state obligations as far as children without parental care are concerned, like the provision of the right to alternative care and any other rights that these children are entitled to?
Yeah. It is interesting to note, by the way, that children without parental care are included in all the technical notes that are developed at the moment by the international community. And I know it's very far away from any realities, so we have to be critical, but it is there. So if you go, for example, to the website of this Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, you will see reference to children without parental care. And I think that is extremely important. And it's built on the notion, of course, that we need to take extra care of these children. In terms of the human rights obligations, the strength, I think, of the children's rights framework is that it is primarily about the child's right to develop in a harmonious way, in one or the other way. Of course, there is a lot of attention for the family, but it doesn't mean that there are no obligations in addition to the basic obligations to take extra care of children who are not finding themselves in a supportive family environment, which is considered so important. So, and the guidelines of an alternative care, of course, provide an additional framework there. So the solution, I mean, not the solution, I mean, the way to approach this, I think, is to provide, of course, as much as you can with some kind of alternative care, and there you have to be extremely careful, because that should not automatically mean that you place a child in an institution or something. You have to be extremely careful. And I think one of the, last year the global study was on children deprived of liberty was published, and there was a large section on institutional care. And I think it's for the first time, I think, that in such an international survey, institutional care is considered to be an issue of extreme relevance. And I think if you take a look at the number of children in institutional care is a serious issue. And I'm glad that the UN global study also raised that and flagged that. And now we see that maybe that's one of the good things also of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we have reason to be extra concerned about children in an alternative care setting. So there, I think we have now reason to pay much more attention to that particular group than we had before. But alternative care, also for children without parental care, and there's also reference to child-headed households, for example, they find a very strong basis in the articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this is a general answer to you, Veronica, but you can make it concrete if you want to more. But there is, I think, quite a strong basis for claiming attention.
Thank you. We have few more minutes left. I think I request Zoya quickly ask your question briefly.
My question is regarding these dysfunctional families. The children, they are being part of those families where their parents are fighting and they're going through a lot of cases also in the court. Now, and the children are also treated as shutters by them. Now, my question is that what are the required laws according to you, which are essential to protect the rights of children, and what can be done by the family courts to ensure that children don't suffer? So, those rights which are of harmonious environment in the family, everything, so that gets suffered. So that is my question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, and it's happening across the globe. It's a big concern for family courts also to deal with. It's difficult also. But I think one of the strengths, of course, of children's rights is that it enables you also to focus on the individual child as part of that conflict. So where family law and family law responses also to conflicts within the families are no longer only defined by the conflict between the parents and the, let's say, direct or indirect impact that has on children. So with children's rights, I think it gives you reason to see the child as a party in the whole decision making, at least as an interested party. So with individual interest, that's what I mean. So that also gives you the opportunity to, for example, appoint an external pair of eyes to make an assessment of what is needed for children. Children, in my view, on the basis of children's rights, can make also an individual claim there. Listen, I am subjected to the conflict between my parents, or the conflict as a result of parents acting within the family. And it's not necessarily only a conflict between parents. So my interests and rights are at stake as a child. And then it's not only about your presence in the family and your right to have contact with parents, but it's also it's also about your right to protection of physical and mental integrity. Article 19 of the Convention is extremely strong in protecting children, in proclaiming that children should be protected against violence, and violence as an issue has been, it has been interpreted extensively. I sometimes make the joke you cannot even look at a child anymore, or he is subjected to violence. And don't get me wrong, it's serious. But Article 19 is very powerful. And what does the Children's Rights Convention do? They give you, as a court also, reason to focus on the child as an interested party in the conflict, in the problem. What is then the solution? Yeah, that is not easy. It may mean that a child has to be placed somewhere else. It may also mean that you order a parent to live somewhere else. But it is at least providing you with a focus on the child as an actor in that whole highly problematic setting. And in addition to that, it is also, of course, then a matter of including children in also in the proceedings. So, talking to the children, listening to the views of children, etc. Difficult as it is, I know how difficult that is, also from practice.
Thank you. Kisu would like to ask one question. Kisu? Kisu?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, sir. Nice to meet you. I am Jisoo from Myanmar. So the question I would like to make is about the children in IDP camps. Because of COVID-19, there are travel restrictions around the country, in our country. And so, but there are still some, in some parts of the country, there are still some military engagements between the insurgents and also the government military. And so people had to flee from their locations and refuge in the IDP camps. And so how can we, so for now, because of the travel restrictions, many of the civil societies and the people cannot reach out to those areas, which is quite difficult for this time of the pandemic. And so how can we help the children in those areas? What can we do at least?
Yeah, this is of course extremely problematic and doesn't help if you just bring the text of the convention. So I mean, you have to be extremely resourceful there. Of course, you have to, in one way or the other, engage with the responsible governments, and that is, I know, a very difficult issue in this particular context. Also, I think we have to. What is important here is to identify the children as displaced persons, because it provides us with an additional framework. It provides us with additional legal frameworks also. And then children's rights should not be used in isolation. They should be connected also to the approaches we have developed with regard to IDPs and also EDPs. So I think it's extremely important to try to bring these frameworks together. But of course, that should ultimately deliver. So it is not a matter of bringing that together and then it's done. So you have to force yourself a way in one or the other to get these children out. It is a matter of visibility there. So making the point publicly that there is a lot of children that are in these camps and they are in urgent need. It doesn't offer solutions straight away. I mean, I in Europe, I can think of children as well that are really stuck. So one of the problems, I think, with displaced children, but also with refugee children and migrating children, or whatever you call, how you frame them, they are often stuck. They are lost. They are invisible. And we have in Europe, we have children in the Greek camps, and they are not allowed to go to the other countries, and countries are not willing to receive them, my own country included. It's a disgrace. and it's not happening. It's simply not happening. So we have all kinds of arguments why we think that there should be focus, there should be attention, there should be action. It is not happening. I think the only way forward is to keep the pressure on it by bringing the stories up, by showing the impact, by saying, listen, this is not something you can leave. This is about your responsibilities. And if you can't do it alone, ask for collaboration and cooperation from other countries or whatever. There is civil society ready to help. There is international organizations that are interested to support. But we have to do something about it. And that's something you have to repeat. And again, and again, and again.
Thank you. Bhavna.
Yes, good evening, sir. Sir, I wanted to ask, it's a very simple question, that is there not a possibility that during this pandemic, when the whole world is undergoing the lockdown process, is there not a possibility that the incidence of child sexual abuse at home might reduce? I'm not talking about the children who are stuck at the childcare institutions. I'm only asking about the children who are at home, because there have been incidences of child sexual abuse at home as well, where the perpetrators are known to them. Because during this lockdown, every child and every parent is at home, and children are in the custody of their natural guardians.
Well,
so this is the question. Thank you.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. One of the problems with violence in the home, with violence against children, and unfortunately it includes sexual violence, is that the perpetrators are often persons that are very close to the children. So, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019, but it may have been 2017, so don't get me wrong, UNICEF published a report, A Familiar Face, which shows that the amount of the violence children across the globe are subjected to is often, in the vast majority, committed by relatives, family members, parents. That's why it's called a familiar face. So on the basis of that, we have reason to believe that children who are forced to stay at home without any opportunities to reach out to the outside world are under threat. We don't know it exactly because it needs a full assessment again. But the assumption, I think, is very valid. So I'm cautious in assuming that the natural family is a safe place. Often it is, luckily, but we also know that often it isn't. And in light of that, I'm concerned. Generally, the problem is not only the perpetrator; it's also the opportunities to see what is happening, to have access to children, or for children to have access. That's why I would say child helpline is essential.
Thank you. One question I would like to ask in terms of just knowing the fact, Professor, does Netherlands gives unemployment dole, and are they continuing during this COVID times?
Employment rates, you mean?
Employment dole, yeah. Unemployment dole.
Oh, you mean a benefit?
Yes, unemployment benefit the Netherlands is giving, or is it been continuing during this time?
Nah, yeah, it is. Yeah. You know, the Netherlands has the position to be a very rich country. So yeah, we are very fortunate there. And what happened is that many of the companies, but also particularly private companies, they were offered opportunities to continue the payment of their employers with support of the government for 90%. The minimum cash support for families was also continued. And at this point, there was no reason. There was generally no reason to add to that. And that's why we also think that child poverty in the Netherlands should not happen, because we can solve it. But I'm completely aware of the fact that this is a very luxurious situation, and we are also helping big companies at the moment to get out of the issues. But there's nevertheless there is big concerns about companies that will ultimately not survive, and that will result in a higher level of unemployment, and that will have impact on Dutch families for sure, like it had in the economic crisis of 28. So, but of course, it's all relative. That's the point also I want to make.
Thank you, Professor. I have the last question, and we are running over time. Shobit, the last question, kindly be brief, to the point. Shobit.
So my question is, sir, what is the psychological and behavior impact on children as they're staying at home and not going to the school to attend school during COVID times?
Yeah.
And so, what is the psychological behavior impact on the children who are seeing their parents fighting, for example, sometimes physically and verbally?
No, it doesn't matter. The psychological impact can only be assumed to be big. So the COVID pandemic and the measures taken as a result of it have led to disruptions of social life. So indeed, as you mentioned, children are forced to stay in the home, and there's potentially a lot of tension in the homes. There's less contact with friends. But we have to be careful in the sense that we don't exactly know. So one of the claims we made last week is to say you have to assess the mental health needs of children. And that is not only psychiatric health needs, it's also really just the psychological health needs, support. Vital social systems were disrupted. Play has been given a completely new dimension. So we have to make sure that we address that, because the impact will be big. And that is at a general level. But if you zoom in on vulnerable children, the impact may be even bigger. But there's generally the assumption, and I think there's all the reason to have that assumption, that there is a negative and significant negative impact on the psychological health of children, and then across the board. So ranging from the young children to the adolescents.
Okay, Professor, this is the last question from my side. It's been asked by one of the participants. How do you foresee the children involved with offenses?
Well, there's different answers to that. But the first is that there are specific concerns about children in the juvenile justice system. Courts sessions were postponed. Children could not be present during their cases. Children in detention, of course, is an issue of concern. I think many of the justice system are now restarting. That means that there will be attention again. But in terms of the pedagogical orientation of juvenile justice, I think it's important to be fast, to give priority to children, and to make sure that children can also actively engage and participate in the proceedings. So that is a big issue. But if you take a look at other societal impact, then we have reason to be concerned about children that are vulnerable and run the risk of becoming part of the criminal justice system by committing offenses. And for example, because of the lack of structure, of course, when they are inside, probably it will be quite fine. But because they're also losing structure in terms of the educational programs, in terms of their vocational training, maybe in terms of their contact with peers, they also run the risk of being dragged into the system again. And that is a risk that we have to tackle, because then we will end up with a rise of the number of children inside the criminal justice system, while we were in many countries seeing a decrease of the number of kids. So COVID could be very disrupting there. Yeah.
Thank you. This was the last, but I think one participant is Fiametta. Please go ahead and quickly ask your question.
Hello. Yes. I wanted to just quickly ask, what has been done for kids with pre-existing conditions, like physical conditions and even mental ones, and how can they have access to life-changing or saving life supporting care, both mentally and physically and like overall sort of health all around, because there has been a lot of focus on COVID, but then everything else seems to be kind of cancelled. So
it's a very good question. The answer is that I don't have a global picture on that. And my take on it is that because of the disruption of the healthcare services, the regular healthcare services, and also you can add anything there: youth care services, mental health services, access to services for children with disabilities, for example. I think there has been across the board disruption, and that also means that these children may have suffered from it and may have been set back in terms of their treatment, in terms of their support. That is one of the big reasons why we should focus on children with disabilities and children with specific needs. Let's put it slightly broader. And that is also one of the claims that is made all the time by international agencies, is that the impact of COVID-19 has been so immense on the long run as well. So because we want these children to be part of our communities and our societies, and that is the ideal. And I know that is a challenge as such, but one thing we should, for example, prevent is that because of these children suffering more and maybe even causing also more issues, that they, for example, are institutionalized because we don't know how to deal with them. So we have to be very careful that we are critical enough to what we see as going back to the normal, because I think we will miss many people. They will not be able to go to normal without support.
Thank you. With this, we would like to conclude our session. And I'm thankful to Professor Liefaard for giving us so much time today, valuable time, and you had such a busy schedule. I would like to thank Bar Council of Delhi, its member, Mr. Rajendra Sangwan, who is also present during this session. Professor Ved Kumari is one of the authority on juvenile justice. We would like to acknowledge her presence, and other judicial officers, as well as the members from juvenile justice boards who are participated today. And also thank you to International Bridges to Justice, my team. Thank you everyone for joining this session. With this, we conclude, we end the session. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And it's great to see all my former students as well in the room, and some new as well. So look forward to meeting you soon. Thank you, and it was an opportunity and a privilege, and it's an honor to be in the presence of you all. Thank you.
Thank you.